lectures organised through the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. My name is Stephen Graham. I'm one of the group of colleagues in the school who are involved in organising the series, along with Anne Fry, who's fantastic in doing all of the wonderful organisation. Tonight I'm very excited to welcome one of our two new chairs in architecture. We have two new chairs just starting as we speak in the school on the architectural side. In addition to today's speaker, we have Prue Childs, who's come from Sheffield and does a fantastic amount of important work on the question of practice and community engagement in architecture. But tonight we're hearing from Rachel Armstrong. Rachel's a professor of experimental architecture in the school, who's come up from the University of Greenwich. And I think Rachel's work is particularly interesting at the current sort of impasse, because so many of the taken for granted ideas about architecture, about cities, and about nature, perhaps the role of technology in all of those things, are very much up in the air, very much at a sort of crucial philosophical moment where inherited definitions and ideas about the city being separate from nature, about technology being separate from nature, and perhaps about architecture being separate from nature, are all very much up in the air because of new innovations in biology, in technology, and in urbanism. And we're very much at a moment where we're realising that the whole of the world's environment is effectively being built, is effectively being manufactured through systems where humans have an enormous amount of impact through their technologies, their industries, and their cities. So Rachel's engaging at the front line in what this might mean in terms of really radically new ideas of architecture, really radically new ideas of urbanism, that engages with questions of using biology to perhaps grow architecture, to perhaps grow the fabric of cities. Rachel's particularly interesting in this debate, particularly important, I think, because she has a background in medicine and biology and can actually talk with the scientists at a sort of peer-to-peer level, which is not usual in terms of professors of architecture, so that's particularly exciting. A lot of this is very much at the heart of what we mean by sustainability. And Rachel's done a lot of work as a TED fellow, really getting to some high-level debates there. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Rachel and to hear Rachel speak on the title, of Experimental Architecture Catalysing the Transition from an Industrial Age to an Ecological Era. Thank you.
Oh, thank you ever so much, Steve, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming along tonight. And I particularly want to thank the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape for making available a position at this university that possibly carries the coolest architectural title in the world. So I am actually utterly thrilled. It's a childhood dream to take this position as a professor of experimental architecture. And I really think that both from a student perspective, from a community perspective, and from a kind of a broader industrial perspective, the vision that this school and the faculty have had in creating this post is incredibly timely for some of the big debates that are ongoing and are really important ones to be had right now. So at the start of this new millennium, we appear to have reached a tipping point in the Anthropocene, where we've never been so prosperous or numerous as a species. Yet, we are also in the process of reverse terraforming our planet. We've created an environmental sinkhole and the prospect of a gaping sixth great extinction, where over the last 10,000 years, we have reduced the liveliness of this planet by causing the disappearance of many species like the Ice Age megafauna. Above us and beyond us looms the prospect of a fourth wave of human expansion, something that's being hotly debated and discussed within the space industry right now, which could take us to becoming an interplanetary species, as Elon Musk proposes communities on Mars and life beyond our home planet. Yet we're almost as blind to our cosmic prospects and opportunities as John Milton was when he wrote Paradise Lost, since the visible fabric that we inhabit constitutes only 5% of reality. The rest of it, 68% dark energy and 27% dark matter, is entirely invisible to us as a direct experience. So we're caught between two existential voids, extinction or escape. And perhaps like Milton, we may find cause to nevertheless remain optimistic about our human potential and find bounty here on earth to reclaim our paradise despite the chaos of adversity. Now, our current anxiety is provoked by a rapidly change of sense of being in the world, where for the first time in a couple of millennia, Western civilization has started to understand reality through a different lens. Rather than seeing the world as being made up of a set of hierarchically ordered objects, we're starting to see it as being in a state of permanent flux. Now, we can think of this transition from the fixity of an industrial age, its permanence and its top-down paradigms, as being the start of this tipping point. But the ecological era, which seems to be emerging from out of the ideas that have come and have been born during the industrial era, are being shaped by an overlapping set of developments in philosophy, science, technology, cultural theory, and particularly over the last century. So this isn't something that's sudden. This isn't one hegemony being replaced by another. And I think that our participation is not a conscious decision. It doesn't really matter whether we believe in climate change or good green citizenship or even if we practice recycling. The ecological view is not simply academic, and it's not just a practice that's reaching us now at the start of the third millennium. But think with the advent of the internet, it's become an everyday reality. The Pandora's box has been sprung from previous limits to our current existence, which have been imposed by traditions like geography, identity, culture, materiality. And now we can coherently and simultaneously explore new and potentially contradictory ways of being and living through interconnection, complexity, and process. It was still also largely immersed in industrial age views, materials, and tools. Now, these have helped us and continue to help us deal with modernity, but they're not finely tuned to a constantly changing reality. So as a result, we skip in and out of discontinuous modes of thought, like fish that don't know we're wet. Yet the ecological era does not invite us simply to substitute one way of being for another, when in fact what it's doing is really presenting us with a Scooby snack deck of competing ideas and practical approaches to deal with the immense changes in which we're immersed. In this space, architects are avatars, and the spaces are continually contested. And yet, if we're to continue to retain our viability within an industrial age that isn't going to go away, we need to find new ways of navigating our unpredictable and highly complex world. And this needs new skill sets and new ways of thinking. But these approaches aren't ready-mades. We can't go into the local DIY store and purchase them off the shelf. Rather, they're bespoke and need to be customized and engage with very particular communities, needs, and situations. Now, to achieve this gargantuan undertaking, architecture needs to flamboyantly embrace experimentation. And of course, architecture has a rich history of experimental activities that have inspired architectural innovation, from Giovanni Piranesi's drawings of prisons that influenced Romanticism and Surrealism, to the skin and bones architectures of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe that led to the glass tower facades of skyscrapers. I mean, the list in architecture is endless. Yet at a time of technological convergence and the speed of technological developments exceeding Moore's law, like biotechnology, Steve Jurvetson proposes that biotechnology is actually accelerating beyond that of Moore's law. So the potential for revolutionary modes of practice are arguably greater than they've ever been. And these present radical new opportunities and challenges for our global markets and society. So this current opportunity in experimental architecture, is one in which the tradition of experiment is being taken into a laboratory setting. So Peter Cook, of course, introduced the term into the architectural lexicon in the 1970s, and he was really critiquing the avant-garde of modernism at the time. And really, the person who's developed this as a practice was Levius Woods, whose drawing there of San Francisco after the earthquake really starts to champion this idea of drawing as experiment, where he raises new issues for architectural design that go beyond the reach of established knowledge canons, such as massive scale events like war and natural disaster. So my own contribution really is how to take this set of ideas, these propositions, into a laboratory setting. And I'm particularly interested in how emerging technologies will influence the production and experience of architecture, not exclusively through drawing. Drawing is a very important way of thinking about space and its construction, but also in a very practical context, the development of models, installations, and prototypes. And from this perspective, experimental architecture becomes a design practice that tackles the choreography of space by producing a set of design tactics and spatial programs that are realized and explored through a system of real prototypes. Now, my research specifically embodies an ecological approach, engaging with these notions of ecological era, that is predicated in shifting away from the traditional view of architecture as a static form-giving subject. In fact, you won't see any formal designs that I've produced in this presentation. And rather, really what I get excited about is developing ways of making architecture as a kind of computation, alternative forms of computation. So in this context, architecture is not simply about making a building, but in developing strategic approaches to organizing matter in time and space. So one of the realities that's challenging for architecture in the emerging ecological era is our increasing acknowledgement that matter is lively, not only figuratively, but also quite literally. We are increasingly conscious of how unruly global-scale material flows produce significant challenges for our ongoing survival. These include the petulant weather patterns of climate change, washed-up plastic beaches, and alien metabolisms of garbage tips that leak toxic metals and gases into the environment. But rather than build barriers against the lively properties of matter, experimental architecture proposes to directly engage with its paradoxical qualities of creativity and destruction. A language to sort and order this fundamental organizational process is needed, and this has actually been most extensively characterized by the disciplines of physics and chemistry, which underpin the biological codes that have given rise to the organismal life that we experience here on Earth. But rather than seeing nature as being a resource for consumption by machines, biological processes have been understood through biotechnology over the last 30 years as a way of understanding life's processes themselves as a technical system. Now, to work with these in new ways, rather than just simply inserting them as little soft objects inside big hard machines, we really need a set of material processes, languages, practices that enable designers and engineers to be able to imagine, work with, and compute with them in new ways so that we can shape matter differently, have a different kind of relationship with the natural world. So natural computing is an emerging scientific field that's been inspired by Alan Turing's interest in the computational powers of nature. Now, the goal of these overlapping fields, which range from Andrew Adamansky's work with slime molds, Martin Hansen's work with dynamic droplets, Klaus Peter Zauner's work with biorobotics, they really are looking to develop more nature-based forms of technology. And I'm going to differentiate this from biomimicry very, very quickly. Now, whilst much attention has been given to copying nature and transposing its desired characteristics into a form of practice, which we loosely call biomimicry, and there are lots of definitions of biomimicry, so there are already going to be people who are upset with that definition in the audience. But the issue that I have with biomimicry, which it takes a spectrum of practices that range from purely aesthetic formalisms to ones that are copying abstracted functions, let's say, like condensation on the backside of a beetle and using that to extract water from the air. Biomimicry has this relationship with, let's say, an aesthetic value of the natural world, even when it is functionalized. But what it lacks is a rigorous research strategy. That it's because of its high aestheticization, we always hear about the beautiful dragonfly wings and the gorgeous geometry of sponges. We never hear about stinking rotten carcasses or parasitic worms that infect your brain and suck the juice out. Those aren't the obsessions of biomimicry, and yet this is the nature that Darwin certainly identified with, this nature that's red in blood and claw. So the search space as well is highly idiosyncratic. Oh look, there's a nice one because I have a need for that. There's not a systematic way of looking at the range of outputs that the natural world gives us, which are described by Stuart Kauffman as this almost infinite space, which talks about the potential of evolutionary process, which he calls the adjacent possible. Working with that idea of searchability are more strategic approaches to thinking about what the natural world has to offer. So let's call those the genetic algorithms and the kind of parametric systems. Now, they're based on the idea of code or a mathematization of the natural world. Let's stick with genetic algorithms for the moment and think about analogies between DNA and digital computing that inform design practices like Greg Lynn's gorgeous aestheticizations, this embryological house shown in this picture here, or his crockery set, which is also very interesting. But again, this idea of the algorithmic search has its own limitations in the sense that it is an abstracted set of ideas about effectively a parallel and highly spatialized, temporally rolling, folding, undulating system. What I'm going to propose this evening is a different kind of way of thinking about how we search the potential spaces in the natural realm. And literally by embodying the iterative processes that underpin a lively, dynamic fabric that is our world. What has made our, the planet Earth as unique as we currently understand it to be, even though we may be flummoxed by, the Fermi paradox and, want to know where all the aliens are. just from the chances of probability that given the number of planets in the entire universe, or the universes, that we've not come across another life form yet. But we do have a unique materiality on this planet. And what I'm going to do is to dig down into a set of processes that you may not have heard about, that I think are going to offer us some really interesting new potential for thinking about what it is when we design and think about why we matter. And what's interesting about it is that we don't actually have to abstract information from these systems. Now, the origins of life sciences have been paying close attention to a phenomenon called dissipative structures. Now, I'm just going to ask for a show of hands, just so that I'm not preaching to you, but just to see how many people have heard of those things before. How many people have heard of dissipative structures? Okay, but two. Okay, this is... Okay, dissipative structures are being considered by origins of life sciences as drivers and programs that embody the transition from inert to living matter. So these are a kind of engine for proton life, let's say it like that. And they include a range of naturally occurring examples that happen across a variety of different scales, from crystal growth to dynamic droplets, whirlpools, the birth of galaxies, minimal kinds of proto-life, and even life itself. Now, dissipative structures, like this tornado, are spontaneously formed by the massive flow of energy and matter through space. And they're first described by Nobel Prize-winning chemist Ilya Prigogine in the 1960s, for which he got a Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1977. Now, I'm showing you this picture of a tornado because in your mind's eye, try and imagine those at different scales. So when I start to describe these things, you can understand them as being a different kind of object to one that might be described through Euclidean or our common or garden geometries. Okay. What's interesting about the tornado is that it has a recognisable structure. See a tornado, you know it's a tornado. It's not all over the place. You think, what the hell is that? I don't know what it is. I have to do some tests. I mean, if we try to measure carbon dioxide in this room, we have to rely on indirect evidence. A tornado is pretty much recognised by a certain set of features. But the thing is as well, it has a range of features in which its tornado-ness can still be recognised. What's also interesting about it is that although it looks like an object right there in the middle, if you think of yourself as a storm chaser, you can actually imagine now you're starting to feel the wind and the effects of that object in that space, even though you've not come across the boundary yet. So if you think of a classical object, you don't feel the effect of that object at any distance from the phenomenon itself. And this is where this dissipative system, these dissipative structures, really start to get very interesting, because they have a set of properties that we don't normally design and engineer for, because they are far from equilibrium. Okay, that means they possess their own energy, they have their own effects, and let's be poetic about it, they have a will and force of their own that is independent of human activity, independent of whether we are granting them the status of being or not. And each of these dissipative structures can be thought of as being, let's say, a kind of accounting process. So if we think about computation and what computation really is about the way that we sort and order things. And our conventions really are that we count in order for us to sort and order things. Now, the question is really, does nature count and sort and order in the same way that mathematics does? Classical thinking and the Renaissance says, hell yeah, they're golden ratios, they're geometries underpinning everything. But the dissipative structure challenges this, let's say, tidy, equilibrium-based perspective. So the dissipative structure is actually the engine of nature counting. We can consider that as being like a one, but it's not a one. We have created a language, a discrete language of counting, whereas nature itself is a continuous way of sorting and ordering things. But the importance of this means is that the way that nature sorts and orders can be understood by looking at the patterns produced by these systems. Now, this isn't out of the box for architecture. We already start to understand the value of patterns in understanding underlying processes. So, for example, Mike Batty has likened city growth to the production of fractals. Now, by recognising fractals in a city, we can then think about what we understand about fractals to start to then think about how we might design policies or communities or resources that help us deal with the fractal nature and what we understand about this kind of system, but transpose it into the language of cities. And so what I'm saying is that by studying dissipative structures, we can start to recognise the patterns that they produce, and therefore think about the phenomenon that we are actually trying to manipulate, we're trying to sort, order, and give value to. So, of course, we're going to try and do this in experimental architecture. So, by recognising that maybe we don't have to represent nature, but we can dig right down into the foundations of its ordering systems in structures called dissipative structures that aren't classical objects based on equilibrium systems, but are highly atypical and very interesting objects called dissipative structures. We can start to put together, let's say, a set of computational strategies that help us compute with natural systems in a different way that is fundamentally lively. So at the end of the day, we don't end up with a great big stack of objects and go, well, how are they going to become life? Because fundamentally, they possess these qualities that we already recognise in dynamic systems. So these are the experiments I'm going to show you that help us understand a few techniques, how we might set these systems up, how they're actually scaled, how we then sort and order with these things, how we might deal with persistence and what kind of infrastrucures they need in order for them to be operational within a particular space. Have a look at how we might execute commands. Have a look and see what kind of aesthetic practices they may provoke. And then how we might design with them in context. Okay, so how do we make one of these things? How do we make a dissipative structure? I mean, do we really have to have a tornado-making machine? Well, there are tornado-making machines around, but we can actually do this much more subtly in the laboratory. And this is a very, 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 very simple system that set up, that can be done with kitchen ingredients, that precipitate very transient dissipative structures. Now, the importance of this is that dissipative structures can be provoked spontaneously. So you don't have to make one. What you do is you set the conditions of probability for them to arise. So in other words, you're taking the design process away from the production of an object, and you're dealing with the probability of an event happening. So you're kind of digging down into the preconditions for design. You're taking a step back from your aesthetics, from your expectations, from the, let's say, the deterministic paradigms which the industrial age has set up for us as being a strategic way of manipulating matter. So taking a step back, what we do is we set up an interface between potentiating fields of activity, and the potentiation here is all over water. On the top we have olive oil, which hates water. On the bottom we have glycerin, which loves water. And then we create an agent for the tension in the middle. And so what we do is we just take a food colouring droplet and we put some salt in there for added complexity. And so the salt, particularly when it's impure, has its own force and will try and hang on to any water in that coloured droplet. So what I do is I take a pipette, and I drop a single drop down onto the interface between the oil and the glycerin, and the droplet will shiver and shake for a while whilst these molecular forces are under contest. And then the droplet loses control, and it can no longer hang on to the water, which is sucked down into the glycerin. And what you see are these structures here. And these are very transient dissipative structures. You'll see these little salt trails. That's what's remaining of the water-soluble colour in the droplet. And then you'll see a second phase of sideways expansion of the fat-soluble part of the droplet. So you're getting a three-dimensional painting. But the point of creating this experiment was to show that when we're thinking about dissipative structures, you're not building a dissipative structure out of a series of let's say, objects. What you're doing is you're provoking self-assembly by creating a tension and an interface. And that's a different way of thinking about producing an object, okay? So the second thing is, okay, right, so we can produce one of these objects. That lasts, let's say, about 0.2 of a second. Not very useful. So let's have a look at some strategies that may be a little bit more useful. And for that, I'm going to show you a strategy that's used by life itself. Now, this big hairy thing here is a bryopsis. It's about the size of my hand, 15 centimetres across, and it's in the Black Sea there. It actually lives around all European shores. But it's a giant cell. And what that means is it's got one membrane on the outside. It's got loads and loads and loads of little nuclei. And each nuclei is associated with energy-producing organelles, so little energy centres around each nuclei. And if you take that bryopsis, a green seaweed, and cut it up like sushi using a razor blade, we can call it the terminator organism because it will reassemble itself. Give it a few weeks and some alkali solution. That giant cell body will start to reconstruct itself entirely from fragments. And when it does so, given it another colloquial name, it has a dustbin metabolism. Anything in its environment that you leave in there long enough will be taken up into that giant cell body. And so if you leave little magnetic particles called magnetite in that dish, you can actually get the giant cell to be magnetic. And if you leave a fridge magnet with some kind of shape underneath it, you can actually pull that cell together into a desired shape. So here I've got I attempt an Ouroboros using fridge magnets that I probably wasn't supposed to destroy. However, this is a way of showing that a dissipative structure arises spontaneously, but it can be grown through inclusion. So if you think of your tornado, a tornado doesn't change its nature by assimilating a house, but it can grow and be changed by the things that are taken up into its system. And it's the same with these dissipative structures. Now, most of my work has been done with this particular dissipative structure, which is the Bouchy system. So again, you can see you provoke a set of objects by creating interfaces for the production of, let's say, agents within the system. And what we're really interested in are these ones here, the ones that continue to still have liveliness. So you can see, so I've added sodium hydroxide, 3 molar here, to a field of olive oil. This is an experiment that was over 100 years old, 1892, described by a German zoologist called Otto Büchli. And he was interested in this system as a way of disproving vitalism. So that over the course of the 19th century, there was this great debate as to whether biology was just a more complicated form of chemistry, or was there something that was infused, really special inside every biological cell, a vital force that gave it this kind of unique quality. And that debate actually came from alchemy, and on which modern chemistry has been founded. This differentiation between the organic and the inorganic world is actually an old alchemical idea. The difference being, if you take an inorganic substance and you heat the hell out of it, and then you add water, you can resurrect it. If you take an organic substance and you heat the hell out of it, you end up with a black tarry mess that cannot be resurrected underneath, under any circumstances. And so, these ideas and forms of differentiation are actually, going way, way back into, the foundations of modern chemistry. So here we're looking at an old idea about whether the system that Buchley was looking at was an artificial amoeba. So he thought it was a single-celled organism. That was the system that I've used to set up a series of provocations. And using those tiny little bodies, I could start to modify them in a way whereby if I added things to the internal body, so here I've added some salts, and so you can see that they start to transform within the body. This has actually been modified, slowed right down. I've added its own waste products to make it much bigger. But it gives it a new set of properties. So we can change the system by giving it new internal chemistry, or we can change the product. So here we've got another magnetic object inside these droplets here. But we can also change the system by giving it a set of external new conditions. And here, these Buchley droplets, which are all about, when they're unmodified, about 1 millimetre across. And as you can see, magically, they've got they actually don't have any DNA. They don't have a central processing code that biology has in order to be lively. Okay, this is what you're looking at here is a field of olive oil. You're looking at a little tiny droplet of self-formed sodium hydroxide here. You can start seeing little structures here. So each of these has a little metabolism. So the metabolism obviously produces soap. So often they produce these little tails and little bodies, which are a result of their metabolism. So you can hear one's being transformed by its metabolic process. So instead of being round and fat, it's kind of spiky and long. And what's happened in this particular environment is that I've added alcohol. And these droplets absolutely love alcohol. They will flock around the site of alcohol. They quickly become transformed and very inert. And we think that this is because they have their surface tension changed. So when you reduce the surface tension of the oily medium, which is really viscous, I don't know if you've ever swum in a bath of oil, I certainly haven't, but I can imagine it's quite hard work. But when you reduce that by adding alcohol, you can swim much more freely. So off they go, they head towards the place where it is less viscous, and they end up in this kind of huggy clump. So really we can entice them into spaces that they don't really know that they want to be in yet. Now, what's interesting about these little sets of experiments is that we need, in order to set up these boundaries, we need the right kind of infrastructures that encourage liveliness. So how on earth, when I'm looking down a microscope and looking at bodies that are about 1 millimetre across, how on earth do I make this have any kind of tangible connection to an architectural scale? Well, Philip Beasley in the 2010 Architecture Venice Biennale provided me with this opportunity. And this is the important little, one of the important little bits here. This is a little vial of infrastructure. And really, infrastructure is the key in enabling the dissipative system to do this kind of counting and sorting and ordering that is conducive, not representative. It embodies processes that underpin, let's say, lively forces that make our natural systems as interesting as they are. So here we have a tiny vial that is distributed. So the way that, I was never going to be able to afford to make a 19 by 4 by 3 metre swimming pool that I could fill up with olive oil and then throw some sodium hydroxide in. So what I had to do was to work out how I could use strategic spaces or organising hubs within this hylozoic ground matrix, which consists of a plastic dynamic cybernetic matrix that has a primitive neural network. It's got proximity sensors, It's got a range of, let's say, mechanical sensory types and paradoxical behaviours. So if you approach this particular swallowing object here, it raises some friendly spiky fronds, which are actually quite rubbery. It's kind of off-putting, but it's really entirely harmless. So what I did was I created these little environments, little wet environments, and they had to last for 3 months. Now, the naked Bouchley experiment will last for anywhere between seconds to about 40 minutes, you know, at the scale of a millimetre. These ones had to last for 3 months, so I had to slow them right down, which meant that their movement was greatly attenuated, but they still continued to transform over time. It was just in a very different way. And here you can see them growing highly coloured objects using an internal metabolism. Put these salts in, and those salts in the presence of carbon dioxide gave off brightly coloured chemistries. They're about the size of a little fingernail, so each one of those droplets now is on the centimetre scale, and people could actually, you know, go underneath them. We put them out of the range of people reaching for them, because the first time we installed these, they were so shaken and stirred, it wasn't funny. I had to replace them. Yeah, they don't do very well on shaking up. But then the question is, you know, we're in Venice now, and how can we scale this further? So the idea was that maybe we could make these dissipative structures operate within the context of the city itself. And so the idea for the Future Venice project is born. Now the idea was to develop the potential for dissipative structures to work at an urban scale, using the infrastructure of the city, which of course, as you know, is based on a waterway. So you've got the main lagoon, and then you've got canals that infiltrate into the city. Using this particular structure, we wanted to equip the city fabric itself with the capacity to fight back against the elements in a struggle for survival. So could we undergo an origins of life type transition of the city fabric so that it was conducive with the idea of a natural kind of survival? And we did this by creating a set of programs for droplets that would be able to take dissolved minerals and carbon dioxide from the waterways and then transform them into tiny little shells as an accretion technology that could be directed underneath the city's foundations, where they'd form an artificial limestone reef. We can do that because we can actually also make them photophobic, not like the light. So this is an actual experiment. I haven't got a film of it, but this is a dynamic moment where the droplets are actually moving through the water. As you can see, they're moving towards the darkened area there. And ultimately, we noticed also that when you do a survey of the canals, these processes are already engaged by the marine wildlife. So these are actually tiny thrombolites that are produced by the marine wildlife in the city of Venice here. So a thrombolite is literally a biological rock. It's produced by microorganisms that take the sediments that are in the water, and when they die, they leave these sediments as almost like tiny skeletons, and then that forms the basis for the growth of the next colony of algae or bacteria. And so with time you actually get these tiny little rocks that are grown by organic processes. And the idea was then that we could actually hybridize the artificial system that was harvesting minerals out of the waterways and work together with the marine wildlife. And this is a series of projects that are still ongoing. But we do need to do surveys to actually figure out how we can work conducively with the marine wildlife. And for that I need let's say, a more environmentally friendly set of oils than I currently have access to. So that's where I'm at with that, before you ask. But what was interesting about working in Venice as as a site for experimentation, conducting surveys, fieldwork. I was trying to talk about the potential of the site, and I don't know if any of you actually seen some of the computer renderings that were done of future Venice, where you get that stromatolite-like infrastructure that Christian Kerrigan quite beautifully put together. And I was thinking about, well, computer renderings are fine, they very quickly start to represent a set of ideas, but actually are there a set of aesthetics that natural computing itself embodies that helps us understand this idea of a process-led aesthetic, the notions of dissipative structures, the idea of a material realm in flux. And so I started to think about the ancient practice of hydromancy. Now, hydromancy was one of the ancient alchemical practices that was a form of scrying. So scrying is the ability to read into the future by looking at interfaces. Hydromancy specifically looks at water interfaces. And that, for me, started to reflect on many of the images that were being produced through the Venetian canals themselves. And so the idea was that, the hydromancers were folks that could read the semiotics of these spaces to interrogate possible futures. And I feel that there is something about these qualities that, let's say, are not simple geometries that would be very hard to create using our conventional softwares, but were being spontaneously evolved and provoked by these juxtapositions of interface, the things that give rise to the dissipative structure in situ in a city. And so, there's a kind of a provocation through an aesthetic experience that the interface and these spontaneous processes starts to talk about, in which these sites are potential materialities. They're not wild fantasies. They're actually stretching material possibilities in, let's say, unevenly distributed presence. And that by iteration, say for example, that first set of fingers that are produced by this light shadow here, you can see how the iterations here may cause growth of the algae that you can see through the absence of light, and that could be less there, and there may be more in the light-soaked areas. So you can see how the relationship of environment to its elemental infrastructures is it's not abstracted and divorced from a materiality. We're actually speaking about multiplicities here. So these rhythms and potentialities are ways of thinking about a probabilistic aesthetic. These are probabilities, possibilities, things that are yet to be, let's say, instrumented or technically coaxed into being. So I thought that rather than keep representing these through classical modes of, let's say, geometric designs, that perhaps we were also looking at a range of different kinds of aesthetics for their production. So really, okay, so this is all very nice, but how might this relate to a contemporary architectural practice? Well, I think that these kinds of ideas about moving materialities, dissipative structures, the innate forces that operate within the natural realm become organs and hubs of material organisation within cities. And we may think of these as being organs for buildings. So if we transposing them from Venetian waterways into a home environment, we might actually see something like the Philips microbial home here, which is a set of bioreactors, and this is based in Amsterdam. And it's a speculative proposition in which the bioreactors are incorporated into, let's say, under-imagined and under-designed spaces, in those objects where they're producing light over here. These are bacterial organs that produce bioluminescence. There is methane-producing bacteria here using kitchen waste to produce energy for cooking. And all of these become technical platforms through which the biological imperative can be harnessed to perform work like machines. So we're orchestrating them in a way to produce, I guess, a micro-agriculture. And this is a real building here, and this isn't just speculative design. So as far-reached as these ideas may seem, these are actually being built today. So this is Arup's EIQ house, the Intelligent Building House. It was opened in November in Hamburg, and what you're looking at is a set of apartments that have these green facades on the outside. And inside each one of these facades, we think of each one of those facades as being a field in which little green cows live, and they munch on carbon dioxide and sunlight. And the carbon dioxide is being pumped in through air that is rising in the system. So we can think of these as being 2.5D spaces, really, because these structures here are stopping the algae from sticking to the glass windows. So instead of double glazing, we've actually got a whole liquid field of biomass-making substances that are literally using our resources in a different way. So these are kinds of micro-agricultures. In some ways, we're shrinky-dinking the urban agriculture, using the power, the processing power of microorganisms to more effectively operationalize resources in an urban environment. So these things are actually happening, and whilst the aesthetics are a bit like when the first iron bridges were being constructed in these parts of the world. The first kinds of designs that were made with iron for bridges, had dovetail joints, which are obviously great for wood and don't really play to the strengths of steel. And I think that these are the kinds of juxtapositions that we're actually seeing in these first prototypes and experiments with living systems situated within modern homes. And I think that these kinds of sites are going to be transformed quite wildly as our understanding of how it is best to work with living system starts to change as well. How we start to work with the strengths of these systems and not keep trying to transpose them back into a world that we know. And so I'm just going to quickly talk about the idea of potentially, going even further with this and using the idea of a manifesto for soft living architecture as a way, I guess, of creating a portrait of possibility for what these computations and material systems may offer us. So really we're talking about material systems, malleable scaffoldings, with a complexity that we can liken perhaps to soil, which can change with time and possess discrete lifespans. They're not designed for immortality. They are inherently site-specific. They are not universal. They are clustered. They are sown, not manufactured. They're provoked. They arise all at once and are provoked into existence as a sudden dissipative seed of organising material. Each is unique and follows an individual developmental trajectory which is entangled with the character of the site. Soft living architectures grow as a consequence of transient alliances and material assemblages. Their bodies remain semi-permeable to their sites. They're not barriers between ourselves and the natural realm. And their first manifestations are porous, rich, gelatinous frames. They proliferate, are canalized, and gradually harden through their permeability to rich mineral flows. And spatial variation takes place within planes and localities. They give rise to tissues and membranes that form between loosely associating materials and generate rolling hubs of organisation that fold again to produce architectural organs. They don't seek permanence or self-similarity, but produce new morphological layers over different sites. They're a form of propagation and material extension that do not require central spatial plans or deterministic programs, but bud off seedling fabrics and breed new architectures as a bespoke range of embryological architectural events. Yet soft-living architectures may senesce as they break down. These errors become opportunities for the emergence of new programs. As one dissipative system collapses, it provides the starting point for another iteration or cluster of lifelike events that collectively enrich our environmental fertility. So various kinds of ecological citizens may dwell within soft-living architectural bodies. Perhaps when the systems are tiny, they may house a colony of bees. Later, they may provide nesting sites for birds. With further extrusions, they may become useful as storage vessels of human living spaces, and eventually they may reach the dimensions and structural maturity of social areas. And within these structures, a range of events may occur that are orchestrated through metabolic interconnections, like the actions of mother trees, which promote the welfare of successive generations of saplings through a strange symbiotic relationship with fungal networks, and use strategies like localized collapse, repair, or even proliferative growth in terms of their survival. And essentially, these generative practices produce new relationships, encourage different kinds of communities in which our notions of citizenships become challenged. I mean, in a city, should we really have citizenship exclusively to humans or other species within our native urban environments on whose welfare we coexist and thrive? So, for example, we might begin to see ourselves as having breathing systems that are shared alongside those of trees and green plants, because we have a shared need for oxygen metabolism, and maybe they become part of us. And so, you know, the idea that not only the body of architecture, but the body of people can be expanded, extended, and challenged with the idea of these semi-porous, dynamic, constantly negotiated and potentially contested spaces may begin to become articulated, valued, and socialized. And whilst I resisted a formal design presentation to embody these ideas of a soft-living architecture, perhaps it's worth proposing some kind of archetype. For me, it may be reminiscent of, say, like Gaudi's La Sagrada Familia, but rather than static details that are carved exclusively by the artisanry of people, perhaps it is assembled by its semi-permeable materiality, a bit like the orchestral features of the caves of Nearha, which are the site for the first Neanderthal drawings. So there's a dynamic quality to the production of architecture that I think is implicit in thinking along these lines. So in an ecological era, architects wield significant influence on the fabrics that are unique to this planet, and collectively comprise a force capable of geoengineering scale impacts, and we're already seeing that. They are simultaneously navigators, communicators, visionaries, and risk-takers that are not afraid of the unknown and are able to make spaces tangible through iterative, persistent experimentation. So whatever our vision for the production of space may be in this millennium, it is incumbent on us to embrace an architectural pedagogy that enables students and practitioners to be bold about working with the unknowns of the profession and continue to extend their visionary creativity into commercially viable businesses whilst remaining bold, radical, experimental, ethical, and political, placing the needs of communities at the heart of our emerging ecological era. In creating the position for the study and practice of experimental architecture, Newcastle University has invested a unique and visionary opportunity for students and architects and a range of other stakeholders to creatively explore the potential and desired transformations of the material realm together, in which we may begin to write and design new futures for ourselves, with potential far-reaching impacts So I agree with Milton that despite the calamity in which we appear to be immersed, that we can just be justified in remaining optimistic. And I think that we can do this by sharing a common project with the natural realm, which is the production of life's poetry through our mutual survival.